I was 17 when my stepfather told me that the lake was safe, and that I had nothing to worry about. It was the summer before my senior year of high school, and my stepmother had planned a family weekend at a cabin her parents owned near the water. I had never been particularly close to either of them, but I tried my best because my father had died 2 years earlier, and they were the only family I had left at home. My stepmother, Linda, always treated her biological children differently from me, although she denied it whenever I mentioned it. Her son Tyler and daughter Megan could do almost anything without consequences, while I was constantly reminded that I was lucky they had allowed me to stay with them after my father died. That weekend, everyone decided to spend the afternoon near the lake. Tyler and Megan were swimming close to shore while I sat on a small boat with my stepfather, Mark. He had been drinking and joking around, and when the boat drifted farther from the dock, I asked him to turn around because I wasn't comfortable. He laughed and told me to stop being dramatic. A few minutes later, the boat suddenly tilted when Tyler jumped into the water, and I lost my balance. I remember falling into the cold water and hearing someone shout, but I couldn't tell who it was. I struggled to stay above the surface and reached toward the boat, expecting Mark to help me. Instead, what happened next changed my life forever. Mark pulled the boat farther away. I could hear Linda screaming from the shore, but instead of coming toward me, she shouted that someone should call for help. Tyler and Megan were already heading toward the dock. I remember thinking they were coming back for me, but they didn't. Another family staying at a nearby cabin eventually noticed what was happening and rushed toward the water. They helped me get out and called emergency services. I survived, but I was badly shaken and spent several days recovering. What hurt more than the accident was what I learned afterward. When the police asked everyone what had happened, Mark claimed he had tried to help me but couldn't reach me because the boat had moved too far away. Linda supported his story. Tyler and Megan said they hadn't realized I was in serious trouble. I knew they were lying, but I was 17, frightened, and completely dependent on the family that had just abandoned me. My grandmother, who lived several states away, came to get me after hearing what happened. I told her everything. She believed me immediately. She helped me speak with investigators, and eventually the truth started coming together. Another family at the lake had recorded part of the incident on their phone. The footage didn't show everything, but it showed enough to contradict Mark's version of events. It showed him moving the boat away, while I was struggling in the water. There was no clear evidence of what Linda had done, but her messages afterward created more questions. She had texted Mark that night saying, "Nobody needs to know how bad it really was." When investigators found that message, everything changed. Mark was questioned again, and this time his story didn't hold together. My grandmother immediately took legal steps to make sure I would never have to return to that house. I moved in with her, finished high school, and eventually went to college. I stopped speaking to my stepfamily completely. They tried contacting me several times, but I never answered. For years, I focused on rebuilding my life. I graduated, found a good job, and eventually started my own business. I never forgot what happened at the lake, but I refused to let that day define me. Then, almost 10 years later, I received a letter from an attorney informing me that my stepfather and stepmother were involved in a lawsuit over a property connected to my late father's estate. My father had left several investments and a small commercial property that I had never known existed because Mark and Linda had managed the estate after his death. According to the documents, they had transferred several assets without properly notifying me because I had been a minor at the time. My grandmother had suspected something was wrong for years, but we had never had enough information to challenge it. Now the attorney had found financial records that changed everything. Mark and Linda had used money belonging to my father's estate to pay for renovations on their own properties. They had also created documents suggesting that I had voluntarily given up certain rights when I was 17. The signatures on those documents were not mine. An investigation began, and suddenly the family, who had spent years telling everyone that I was an ungrateful child, was facing serious financial and legal consequences. I returned to my hometown for the first time in nearly a decade to meet with the attorney handling the case. Walking into that office brought back memories I had tried to forget, but this time I wasn't 17 anymore. I wasn't dependent on them. I wasn't afraid of being thrown out of their house. I had my own career, my own money, and people around me who actually believed me. The attorney placed the documents on the table and said something I'll never forget. They thought you were too young to understand what they were doing. They were wrong. I looked at the papers and realized that the truth about the lake had only been the beginning. The same people who had abandoned me when I needed them most had spent years taking advantage of the trust my father had left behind. This time, I wasn't going to stay silent. The investigation quickly became much bigger than I expected. The attorney explained that my father's estate had included a life insurance policy, investment accounts, and a commercial property that had been placed under a temporary trust when I was a minor. Mark had been appointed to help manage some of those assets, but the records showed that money had been moved from the estate into accounts connected to businesses he and Linda controlled. The most disturbing part was that several documents claimed I had agreed to those transfers when I was 17. I stared at the signatures and immediately knew they weren't mine. I had never seen those documents before, and I certainly had never agreed to give away anything my father had left me. My attorney told me that forensic document experts were already reviewing the paperwork. I didn't need to accuse anyone because the records were beginning to speak for themselves. Within weeks, investigators discovered more questionable transfers. Money from my father's estate had been used to renovate a property, pay business expenses, and cover personal debts. Mark had apparently believed that because I was young when my father died, nobody would ever look closely enough to notice. But my grandmother had kept copies of every document she had received after my father's death, and those records didn't match what Mark had submitted. Then Linda contacted me. Her message was surprisingly emotional. She said she was sorry for everything and wanted to meet privately so we could finally put the past behind us. I refused to meet without my attorney present. She responded that I was being cruel, and that she had only ever tried to protect the family. I almost laughed when I read that sentence. Protecting the family was exactly what she had claimed when she told Mark that nobody needed to know what happened at the lake. I sent the message to my attorney, who added it to the case file. A few days later, Mark's attorney contacted mine and proposed a settlement. They offered to return a portion of the money in exchange for me dropping the rest of the claims. My attorney advised me to review everything carefully, and when we calculated the amount they had taken over the years, I realized their offer was nowhere close to what was actually owed. I declined. I wasn't interested in revenge, but I wasn't going to accept another unfair deal simply because they hoped I was tired of fighting. The case eventually reached court, and for the first time in years, I had to sit across from Mark and Linda. Mark looked much older than I remembered. Linda avoided eye contact completely. Their attorney tried to argue that the financial transfers had been legitimate, and that I had misunderstood the documents because I had been young. Then the forensic report was presented. The signatures on several of the documents did not match my verified signatures from school records and other official paperwork. The investigators also found messages between Mark and Linda discussing how they could move the estate money without drawing attention to it. One message was particularly revealing because Mark had written that I would never understand the paperwork. I sat quietly as the evidence was presented. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. These were people who had been part of my life, and they had spent years believing that I was someone they could manipulate simply because I was young when I lost my father. The judge ultimately ruled that the disputed transfers had to be reversed, and that the remaining estate assets belonged to me according to the original legal documents. Mark and Linda were ordered to repay the money they had improperly taken, along with additional costs connected to the case. Several of their properties had to be sold to satisfy the judgment. When the final decision was read, Linda started crying. Mark looked toward me and whispered that he was sorry. I didn't answer. For years, I had imagined confronting them and demanding an explanation for the lake, but standing there, I realized I didn't need one. Their choices had already explained everything. They had chosen themselves over me when I was 17, and they had continued making selfish choices long after I left. The court wasn't punishing them for what happened at the lake because that was a separate matter. It was holding them accountable for what they had done with my father's estate. Still, seeing the consequences of their decisions finally catch up with them gave me a strange sense of closure. After the hearing, my grandmother hugged me outside the courthouse. She told me my father would have been proud that I had stood up for myself. I looked at the building behind us and thought about how different I was from the frightened teenager who had once depended on the same people now being held accountable. I had spent years believing that surviving the lake was the hardest thing I would ever have to do. I was wrong. The hardest part was learning to trust myself after people I depended on had betrayed me. But now I understood something important. I didn't need to destroy my stepfamily or spend the rest of my life trying to hurt them back. I simply needed to protect what my father had left me and build the life they had once assumed I was too weak to create. And as I drove away from the courthouse that afternoon, I realized I had finally done exactly that. For the first time since I had returned to my hometown, I decided to visit the lake. I didn't tell my grandmother because I knew she would worry, but I needed to see that place again on my own terms. The cabin was still there, although it looked completely different. The old dock had been replaced, the trees had grown taller, and the small path leading to the water was almost covered by grass. I stood at the edge of the lake for several minutes, remembering the fear I had felt as a teenager. Back then, I believed that the lake had taken something from me. Now I understood that the lake wasn't responsible for what happened. The people I trusted had made those choices. I took a deep breath and walked away without looking back. That evening, I met with my attorney to discuss what would happen to the remaining assets recovered from my father's estate. He explained that once all outstanding debts and legal costs were handled, the remaining property and funds would be transferred according to my father's original estate plan. There was also one small investment account that had been overlooked for years. It wasn't a fortune, but it had continued growing in the background, and by the time it was discovered, it was worth far more than anyone had expected. My attorney handed me the paperwork and said, "Your father wanted this to give you a fresh start." I stared at the documents for a long time before signing them. I realized that my father had tried to protect me in the only way he could before he died, and although Mark and Linda had tried to interfere with that future, they hadn't succeeded. A few months later, I used part of the recovered money to expand my business, and donated another portion to a local organization that helped young people who had lost a parent. I didn't announce it publicly, and I didn't tell my stepfamily. I simply wanted something painful from my past to become something useful for someone else. Meanwhile, Mark's financial situation continued to collapse under the consequences of his own decisions. The properties connected to the case were sold, the businesses he had built with the misused funds were closed, and Linda eventually moved away. I heard through relatives that they blamed each other for everything. Mark blamed Linda for pushing him to use the estate money, while Linda blamed Mark for believing he could get away with it. I didn't feel sorry for them, but I also didn't celebrate their problems. Their lives were changing because of choices they had made themselves. I had spent too many years carrying anger that wasn't helping me anymore. One afternoon, I received a letter from Mark. He wrote several pages explaining how ashamed he was, and how often he thought about the lake. He admitted that he had been afraid of the consequences that day, and had made a terrible decision. He said he had convinced himself that someone else would help me, and that everything would be fine, but deep down he knew he had abandoned me. He also admitted that after my father's death, guilt had made him increasingly desperate to control the estate because he believed he could somehow replace what my father had left behind. I read the letter twice, and then placed it in a drawer. I didn't forgive him immediately, and I didn't owe him forgiveness just because he finally told the truth. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to ask why. I already knew the answer. Fear, selfishness, and bad choices had controlled his life for years. I couldn't change any of that. I could only decide what I wanted to do with mine. A year after the court case ended, I returned to the lake with my grandmother. We sat on a bench overlooking the water, and I told her that I no longer felt afraid of the place. She smiled and said, "Then you've taken your life back." I looked across the water and realized she was right. The lake had once represented the worst moment of my childhood, but now it was simply a lake. My stepfather and stepmother had once believed they could leave me behind and continue living as if nothing had happened. They believed I was too young to understand, too dependent to fight back, and too far away to ever discover what they had done with my father's estate. They were wrong on every count. I didn't come back to destroy them. I came back because I had survived, built a life of my own, and finally reached a place where their choices no longer controlled my future. The greatest thing I gained wasn't the money recovered from my father's estate or the properties that were returned to me. It was the freedom to stop carrying their betrayal everywhere I went. I had spent years thinking I needed them to admit what they had done before I could move forward. In the end, I didn't. The truth had already come out, the consequences had already happened, and my life was finally mine again. The years that followed were quieter than anything I had imagined. I stopped checking whether Mark or Linda had contacted me, stopped asking relatives what they were doing, and stopped wondering whether they regretted what happened. I had finally learned that peace doesn't always come from getting an apology. Sometimes it comes from realizing that you no longer need one. My business continued growing, and I eventually bought a home with money I had earned myself. The house wasn't huge, but every part of it represented a decision I had made without anyone else controlling my future. I kept one photograph of my father on the living room shelf and another of my grandmother beside it. They were the two people who had believed in me when I had every reason to doubt myself. I never kept photographs of Mark or Linda. Not because I was still angry, but because I didn't want the worst chapter of my life displayed in my home. One summer, almost 15 years after the lake incident, I received a phone call from an old family friend. She told me that Linda had returned to town and wanted to see me. I immediately said no. The friend asked me to reconsider because Linda was seriously struggling and wanted to apologize in person. I told her that I had already heard enough apologies in letters and messages. I wasn't interested in reopening the past. She respected my decision and never asked again. A few months later, I learned that Linda had moved away permanently. Mark had already been living in another state, working a regular job after losing most of what he had built. I felt nothing when I heard the news. That surprised me because there had been a time when I imagined their downfall would make me happy. Instead, it simply felt like information about two strangers. My grandmother passed away several years later, peacefully surrounded by family. Losing her was one of the hardest things I had experienced because she had been the person who gave me a home when I needed one most. During the funeral, I found myself thinking about the teenager who had arrived at her house carrying a small suitcase and unable to understand why the people who were supposed to protect her had abandoned her. My grandmother never treated me like a burden. She never asked me to prove that I deserved her help. She simply opened the door and said, "You're safe here." Those words stayed with me for the rest of my life. After the funeral, I returned to the lake alone one final time. I sat near the water until sunset and thought about everything that had happened since that summer. I had survived the accident, survived the betrayal, survived the legal battle, and eventually built a life that had nothing to do with the people who had once controlled so much of my happiness. I realized then that my story had never really been about revenge. The title people might give it could make it sound like I returned to make my stepfamily lose everything, but the truth was more complicated. They lost their businesses, properties, and financial security because they made decisions that they believed they could hide forever. I didn't take those things from them. I simply stopped allowing them to take from me. The difference mattered. I didn't spend my life plotting against them. I went to college, built a career, helped other people, and created relationships based on trust. Their lives collapsed because of their own choices while mine slowly became stronger because I chose differently. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I stood up and looked across the lake. For years, I had believed that surviving that day was my greatest achievement. Eventually, I realized surviving was only the beginning. The real victory was learning how to live without fear, learning that family is defined by how people treat you rather than what they call themselves. And learning that someone else's betrayal doesn't have to become the story of your entire life. I walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had ever felt near that water. I didn't need Mark to admit everything. I didn't need Linda to apologize. I didn't need anyone to tell me that I had been right. I knew the truth, my father knew the truth, and the people who mattered most had believed me when it counted. Before driving away, I looked at the lake one last time and quietly said, "I'm okay now." Then I started the engine and left. I never returned again. The lake remained exactly where it had always been, but it no longer held power over me. My step-parents had once left me behind believing I would disappear from their lives. Instead, I became someone they could never control again. I didn't come back to destroy them. I came back to reclaim my own life, and that turned out to be worth far more than revenge.